Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IOTSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. As always, I'm Brian Sherman, Content Director for IOTSA and host of our weekly podcast series. Today's special guest is George Bardissi, President and CEO of bvoip, which supplies centralized and cloud unified communication systems through the IT channel. Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, George.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate you having us here.
Awesome. Looking forward to today's discussion. This may be our first all Pennsylvania episode. Covering, I think we have both sides of the state covered, or I should say the Commonwealth. How are things in the Philly area this winter?
Yeah, it's been a mild winter, thankfully. No digging out of any blizzards yet, knocking on wood. We're 2 years removed from an Eagles Super Bowl, so everybody's still kind of mellow, but don't worry. It's going to be football season before we know it again.
That's good. I root for Philly, but I'm a Buffalo fan, and we're getting closer. So eventually we're going to pull the trigger. It's been a long time. But
you definitely do. That's for sure.
Yeah, and our snow totals have not been terrible this winter. I think we're only up to like 2 feet total, so that's pretty mild.
Yeah, but your broken tables totals in the parking lot's pretty high.
Yeah, but you got to have fun.
I know.
Tailgates are for that. So you're a first-timer to our show. So, again, welcome. But I'd like to go in, and if you can tell us a little about yourself, and we'll talk a little about the company, too, up front before we dig into some of the security discussion today. But what led you to a career in IT? That's one of my favorite questions. What's your passion behind the technology space?
I don't think my story is uncommon from the idea that I naturally lean towards technology. I was fascinated with it growing up. It excited me. I had a natural learning curve towards it. And I was just, good at problem solving when it came to the tech stuff. So that's, what ultimately led to me saying, hey, let's see if I can help people doing IT and computer network related, stuff. And I started by myself, right? Just like most people do. Out of the basement, out of the trunk, whatever you want to call it, garage. And progressed through the maturation process of what we now know as managed services, right? And went from anywhere from break fix, project, some stuff covered, some stuff not, bronze, gold, silver, all inclusive, right? I mean, I graduated through it just like anyone else. But I started out of school, naturally, again, mostly self-taught, and then ultimately just, grew my business and started, building and adding people as I went along.
Awesome. So how many years did you do the MSP thing?
I mean, we're still doing the MSP thing, really. So I started out of school, in 2000, 2001. Things really got going around 2003, 2004, where there was a lot more maturation and more people that I brought onto the company. So we're going on quite a bit now, right? Early 2000s still now.
Awesome. So you've got that side of the experience and understanding, peers and what they're going through, which I think is great. But what inspired you to transition from being a primary MSP to also being a vendor?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of great technology come out of companies who are in the trench and understood the pain and realized that there was a gap somewhere. We ran into that ourselves, right? This is kind of bvoip started out of pain. Feeling like there just wasn't a really good option catering to IT service providers, managed services providers. And this was back in the mid-2000s going into the 2010s. There's a lot of Me Too programs out there. We just didn't feel like anything was really designed properly for this industry. We felt there was gaps, and there still are. And so that's why we started bvoip, right? We saw a gap. We saw a pain. We felt like we needed to fix our own pain. And then once we started realizing that pain was being fixed, we said, hey, we can help other people to do this too. And I think the best companies in the channel come from that. People who are in it and have been through it and understand it, and then came out with something that's really functional and useful. Not that the other way doesn't work, right? Companies that kind of back into it and try and take something more enterprisey and bring it down to the channel at our level. I just like it the other way because I think it's a little bit more in tune with what happens on a day-to-day basis.
So you hear it typically from your own clients too. You're not second level, which you get feedback a lot of times from partners, I'm sure, but you have to make sure that it works for your clients, and the brain power that goes into it of making sure it works firsthand, I think, is powerful too.
100%, no question about it. And direct feedback is the best way to speed things up for sure.
Yeah, great. So give us a little description of bvoip. Tell us what the company does, and what makes you unique.
Yeah, I mean, bvoip is designed. We started the company to be channel from the get-go. We're not doing channel as a side piece to direct sales. I know VoIP seems kind of commoditized. There's a lot of players out there. We are operating on an international scale. So we're in Canada and Europe and Australia and New Zealand, and been following down the path that the big guys have paved. But at the end of the day, our main focus, our starting mission, what we're solving for, is to cater to the internal needs of the IT service provider, managed service provider. And once we've connected into their tools, automated their workflow, started creating accountability, reporting, metrics, business intelligence, which takes the tool set to a different level, because now you have information at your fingertips that frankly wasn't easy to get to before, wasn't accessible before, wasn't compiled this way before. Now, and the second thing that we saw for is obviously a channel-based VoIP solution or unified communication solution that can be added into the tech stack or bundle that are offered to the downstream end customer. So, our focal point is first, let's solve the internal day-to-day of the MSP, and then secondarily, let's talk about how we can help them solve that need for their end customer.
Awesome. So I know between being an MSP and a vendor, you've been on the road a lot the last couple of years. So one of the things I wanted to ask is, what was your favorite channel event of all time? And it's okay, to throw out names if you want to, but what made it so great too, I guess, is my second question.
Yeah, so I've been to a ton of channel events. I know you have too. Favorite channel event tends to be the events that we run next to the event, if that makes sense. I've been to IT Nations and Autotasks and Datos and Kaseya's and SolarWinds and Channel Pros and CompTIAs, and I mean the list goes on. There's just so many events every year, and you can get to quite a bit of them if you really want to. And that's just not here in the U.S. That's internationally too. Maybe one of my most favorite events is around one of the last Autotask community lives down in Fort Lauderdale, Miami area. We got a few vendors together and we rented a 5-story mega yacht, and we did a 3.5 hour cruise down the intercoastal. Now I know that may be like a halfway answer, but I think that was really cool of an event next to another event, which honestly I still hear about it. I have people stop me or in the hallway going down whatever event that I'm at, and they still talk about the boat. So that was a good time.
Actually, I think one of my favorite events I was in was probably 15 years ago, and we did a boat trip. We were in Philly, nonetheless, in your area. And it was trying to remember, document imaging channel party, and it was fun, but it was memorable. Yeah, those anytime you can kind of get away from things, even though you're taking everybody with you, it's still usually a fun time. Awesome.
Yep, that sounds like a plan. I mean, anytime there's a boat in water tends to be a good time, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's get down to the nuts and bolts here. I know VoIP offers tremendous benefits for the business community and the MSP community too. But we wanted to dive into the cybersecurity and threat vectors related to voice communications today. What are the key concerns related to these platforms, George?
It's very, people, Internet of Things, right? That's part of what the mission of your organization, right?
Exactly.
Phones have been around for a long time. Now that we're way past the copper line coming off the pole into the building, where somebody has to intercept that physical cable in order to make to listen in on a call, or at the central office to listen in on the call. Now that voice is effectively just an app that overlays everything else that's already in place from a networking standpoint. There are a lot of things that people don't necessarily think about that are potential security related problems. voice systems, not just the transaction of making and receiving a call in real time. I'm talking about the ancillary things that you don't think about that are inside of the systems that run voice over IP unified communications. For example, call recordings, voicemails, directories, right? Your entire company directory could be in the system. Call logs. Every person you've talked to, or every person that's talked to you, that could be vendors, customers, prospects. I mean, this is ultimately stuff that would be information that you'd want to safeguard, or proprietary information. So that's the kind of stuff that can be thought about as a potential security problem. And then the other reality to voice is, and two of the main things that have been happening for a while now, but maybe you don't know about it until it happens to you, is toll fraud. Somebody accessing an account to start hammering on calls on your account. And that could be for a couple of different reasons. One, they're calling high rate areas like international calls and stuff like that rack up your phone bill to a point where you're not happy at the end of the month when you get that bill. And then the other reality is that now that robo dialing and the fraudulent calls that have been affecting pretty much anyone with a cell phone globally now for a couple of years, now that there's enforcement starting to finally come down, it's a lot easier to if I jump onto your system and start dialing out of your system, and now the knock comes on your door because I'm calling on out of your system rather than me having to deal with carriers starting to do enforcement. So there's a lot of different angles to this. Of course, the last concept that you may or may not realize, and 10, 15, 20 years ago, Brian, you thought, oh, that's not going to happen, right? They used the printer to get into the network. Yeah, it can happen, and you can use the phone to get into the network too. So the devices that are being used, the phones, the adapters, all the gizmos and gadgets when it comes to the voice standpoint, I mean, it's another endpoint on the network. We've all seen it with security cameras recently, where these devices are being manufactured in mass overseas. They're not secured well. Now all of a sudden they've been used to get into local area networks or home networks or whatever they're connected to. Back to the Internet of Things thing. So it is a concern, and these are all things that you may not think about, whether you're in an industry with compliance or not. This is information that you may care about, or your customer ultimately may care about. And these are the types of things that from a voice or unified communication standpoint really fall under the security category.
Gotcha. So you're telling me they're not all just like hackers. There's also people that are just jerks that try to get into these systems and wreak havoc.
100%. I mean, imagine, and I've seen it. I've $25,000 bills, $10,000 bills. That kind of stuff, right? Like they've only gone as, if the weakest link is a simple username and password to register as a user or extension to the phone system so that you can start making calls out of that system, that's a not very high barrier. And so ultimately, jerks is one of them, but, thieves is really the right term because, right, you're the one that gets stuck with the bill.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, what valuable information can cyber criminals, those that are really going after the data, what are they looking for specifically in a VoIP system? You touched on it a little bit, but are there other things that?
Well, I mean, like we said, call recordings, call logs,
Yep.
Voicemails, directory information, contact information. These are things that you can get other ways from other tools, from other systems. But when you start to get into the regulated areas, HIPAA compliance is one that everybody has been peppered with at this point. But there's other industries with other regulation too. This is what could be proprietary information, or in HIPAA standpoint, protected health information, PHI. I mean, at the end of the day, you don't think about that. Like, what information would really be in a voicemail? Well, if it's keeping on the theme of the medical situation, could be a prescription refill, could be Social Security number, account number, insurance card, could be a bunch of different things. But then when you get to call recordings, I mean, wide open, right? Nobody wants to have their calls eavesdropped on. And if you do record a lot of your calls, and a lot of people do for many reasons, do you really want that information out on the street? You can't exactly play the Twitter game. Oops, my account got hacked. It wasn't me. No, it's you. It's just out there now. So, that's the type of stuff that you really want to concern yourself with. And like I said earlier, you don't want customer information out there. You don't want vendor information out there. I mean, a lot of people work a long time. Speaking about events, Brian, how many events do these channel vendors have to go to build up their databases? You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars over many years. And, imagine that type of information just gone like that, or being copied or duplicated or extracted. Nobody wants that to happen to them.
That makes sense. I know at our IOTA cybersecurity events, we go through a MSP pen testing, and you can just see as they go through the process, cyber criminals will hammer everything. Ethical hackers as well as bad hackers will hammer every system possible in a business to find a way in. So it just makes sense when you're looking at a VoIP system being part of that. Making sure that it's safe and protected. But how susceptible are the various devices? Are there different risks with desk phones versus mobile when it comes to VoIP? What's kind of the framework?
Can you hear me, Brian?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. I just saw the connection kind of wiggle there for a second. So as far as device security, I mean, I'm going to give you a recent event, Brian. Last week, an article came out from a German internet security firm that Yealink, now the number one VoIP phone manufacturer globally, who edged out Polycom, who I think everybody knows who Polycom is, their redirection services. So this is the function where a phone can call home and get an instruction on where to download the appropriate provisioning files for that device to get connected to where it's going. Their redirection services had many security vulnerabilities. This IT security firm notified them, like you're seeing, this is kind of how the process goes. Hey, somebody's stumbled across these issues. They notify the vendor. They kind of went dark for a while. And this is like recent news, right? So what could be possibly taken from that type of situation? Well, if the redirection services have the MAC addresses, which, by the way, MAC addresses you can't just change. They're hard stamped onto any network card, on any networked device, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Ethernet, whatever. So that's a problem in its own right? Because you're not going to replace your phones after a security event, I don't think. It's not cost effective. But what they got from the Yealink redirection services in this case could be the provisioning URL and the PBX directories and the contact lists, and basically it starts to open up all of the areas that otherwise wouldn't be easy to just stumble onto or guess from the outside. And now all of a sudden, what people don't even think about, right? They're like, well, VoIP systems should have security. How many, after so many bad attempts at trying to register to the system, it should just block them out. Well, what happens when you're just trying to download a file from the system? That's not a registration attempt or a phone call attempt. That's a file download, like just putting a link in my browser. It's very easy to hit a link over and over and over again in sequential order, right? MAC addresses for every manufacturer on the planet are published, right? And this is how they don't cross over, right? So that you don't buy one computer and another and they have the same MAC address and then the network goes wild. So these MAC address ranges are published. And so if I hit that directory over and over and over and over again sequentially, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, eventually I'm going to get a hit. And this is the type of unique, brute force attempt that you don't think about. But wait a minute, how did they even know where to go? Your vendor had a problem. So what you didn't even have a good starting point, right? It happened before you. So that's an example of where things could go badly. And of course, if you don't have the right protections in place and you haven't thought ahead of time to try and prevent that type of situation, you'll find out after damage has been done, like most things.
Yeah, the afterwards. Now, you were talking about some of the modern VoIP phone systems having some vulnerabilities. Are legacy devices any more vulnerable to attack? Are there different things with the first generation of VoIP?
100%. And listen, I get it, right? People don't want to have to buy unless they, absolutely have to.
It's a phone.
I know, but look at the analogy of a car, right? You're at 200, 250, 300,000 miles on the car. At what point does it make sense to stop fixing it and just get something, more modern? When it comes to older devices, keep in mind that the early models, right, of VoIP in the 2000s and the early even 2010s, I mean, these phones were manufactured before a lot of things had really come to light, right? Maybe they don't support HTTPS or SSL or embedded certificates from the manufacturer on the phone. And now all of a sudden, you're going completely open text, wide open over the internet. And that ultimately would be a challenge, right? And so the argument would be, well, VPNs and just keep everything within the network and all of that jazz. Hey, listen, guys, anything, you can do anything. But at some point, as people keep on moving more and more into the cloud and more remote, that's either not scalable or you're just not going to do it because you don't know. And now all of a sudden that device is way more vulnerable than the more modern devices that have already covered some of these angles. Phones are just like any other thing, Brian. Yep. They're like computers. You can't keep them around for 10 and 15 years and expect them to run well. At some point, you need to refresh them. And that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when you look at email, for example, communications are vital, no matter if it's electronic that way or if it's voice. But we're so indoctrinated that email, you need to have layers and layers of security. And with phone service, phones used to be the traditional lines. Now we've moved to IP-enabled phones. I don't know if that same conversation carried over from email. So I think it's fantastic. We should be talking about those type of things, especially in a security channel setting. What are some of the biggest VoIP-related compliance concerns, George? I know you touched on compliance being an issue, but what do MSPs need to have in their mind of thinking about when it comes to VoIP related to various laws and industry standards?
Yeah, I mean, listen, voice generally has its own industry, right? I mean, outside of the technology, there are things like call recording wiretapping laws. There are things like caller ID enforcement that's going to start coming down now from the FCC because of all this spoofing. But generally speaking, you got to start thinking about your phone and your data within your phone system or unified communications platform as any other data that needs to be protected. So like I said, various industries have different, compliances, right? Financial services has compliances. Medical has compliances. People who deal with the government have compliances. And hey, this isn't even just here in the U.S. It could be in Canada or UK, right? Or wherever, where there might be data sovereignty requirements. There might need to be, secure, you need to secure certain types of information. And again, most people don't think about that, the phone system being a data point. But you need to look at it that way. And frankly, this is where, just like any other, and if you take a broad look at most compliances, what are they looking for? Auditing control, making sure there's security, granularity, being able to make sure that where and when and how, and you've put yourself in the best position to prevent the potential issue. Nothing's 100%. We all know that. But if you're not at least taking the best foot forward to make sure that you're not leaving the front door open, then, shame on you kind of thing, right? But of course, compliances usually come with, fines and regulatory bodies and all the other stuff. So when it comes to voice, it's not just the active call, Brian. It's more about the data that's generated around it, like we talked about earlier. And again, every industry and every country and everybody's got their own situation going on. And I think that, IT service providers, MSPs need to really think about that from a compliance standpoint when it comes to telephony.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And when you look at the data, especially, we haven't even talked about the integration side because you're integrating, I know, CRM and there may be billing and payment process. There's a lot of things that are being connected to a VoIP system today. How does that factor in as well, George?
Well, I mean, listen, when you get to the point of APIs and integrating into ERPs, CRMs, PSAs, obviously depending on the vertical, it could be doing an account lookup for your credit card. It could be doing all sorts of stuff. This is also part of the conversation. how is that handshake being done? Is it secure? Are you using correct token technology between your phone system and your CRM system to make sure that that handshake is secure? Yes, I mean the reality is that people can kind of duct tape things just to get things working, and then they have to do it the hard way, the real way, right? Where there's interoperability between vendors in order to make sure things are done properly. There's just so many different variables and gray areas between what technology you're using and what you're trying to connect to, that it does leave an open conversation to okay, can it be done? Yes, but is it being done in a way that it is secure, and is it being done properly? That is the question. Anybody can start trying to put some code together to figure it out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way. It just means that it's a way that you got it to work, if that makes sense.
Well, you mentioned tokens too, and I know multi-factor authentication's become the no-brainer, the standard today, but those protocols aren't always or typically an option for VoIP that I know of. You can let me know if I'm wrong, but I know
you are 100%, Brian. I mean, two-factor, multi-factor authentication, right? People think about it as, hey, I go to my Office 365 portal or my Google Apps or my CRM or my PSA, and it prompts me for a randomly generated digit that I pull up my app for, or it sends a prompt to my mobile device where I have to say yes or no. And when it comes to portal design, absolutely that stuff should be there. I would argue more than 90% of the VoIP solutions out there do not have that even on their portals. So that part should be an easy. But when it comes to VoIP, the way usually that authentication happens is with a username, a password, and a URL and a URL for the phone system or communications platform. And so usually those two pieces of information are all you need. If you brute force enough and have enough time and have enough access. When I say access, right, phone systems generally from a cloud or hosted perspective have been meant to be convenient, meaning I could go anywhere in the world and have access, right? I go on vacation or I'm on a business trip, and we travel internationally all the time, and I'm answering my extension whether I'm in Australia or UK or Philadelphia. But because that openness is there for convenience, it also keeps the phone system platform open for the type of attacks that ultimately result in a problem. So has everyone gone back and figured out a way to add extra layers? No. The answer is no. And that's part of the challenge, right? There's no secondary, blockade put in front of you in order to then ultimately authenticate past the first layer to get to the second layer to get to where you're actually trying to go. It's a one-door situation. And while portals are one thing, actually authenticating to the phone system or platform is another thing. And that's where largely the VoIP solutions out there have been lacking in that department.
Gotcha. So now that we've hammered away at all the vulnerabilities and scared people, especially MSPs that have to handle these things, what can they do to limit the attack surfaces of VoIP solutions?
I mean, generally speaking, are you going to put a VPN everywhere there's a single phone, or are you going to have to manage another device on every router and on every network in order to, have a tunnel between, all of your endpoint users and the phone system, which requires another something that you have to manage on both sides? I mean, it's kind of an old school concept, but I really think that that's not realistic now in 2020. We've taken a completely different approach to it, only because we saw that once again there was a gap, and frankly we wanted to build something to ultimately solve the problem. So at bvoip, that's Barricade, which is a combination of a layer 2 firewall and apps for several operating systems: Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, Linux, so that depending on one or two scenarios, right? Hey, I am whitelisting a set of IP addresses, public static IP addresses, so that this is a good known location, right? For people who are in MFA world, conditional access concept, right? And then for people who are dynamic, mobile devices, home workers, road warriors, people who fly on planes a lot, they'll have apps that will be on their devices with a token that has nothing to do with the phone system, and that token is basically authenticating that device to then get through the front door, the barricade firewall in front of the phone system, to then give them the next set of challenge, which is then the username and the password to authenticate to their extension. Two completely separate technologies working in tandem, but those authentication points don't intersect from where am I getting my username and password for my extension? Where am I getting my security token to authenticate? We're effectively putting that secondary factor in front of the phone system, which you don't think about, right? You're like, well, I thought MFA or 2FA is just this code. Yeah, it's just a different implementation of it, but it's meant to effectively make sure that we're closing the surface and the attack surface in front of the phone system platform, so that we're only allowing what should be good traffic through rather than all traffic through.
And it sounds like it's end user friendly, which I think is the key when it comes to communication.
Yeah. A QR code scan, which I think people are pretty familiar with now, or open up an attachment on your email to set up the app for the first time if you want to do that. But once the app is authenticated, then now you've gotten through your handshake between the firewall and your device, and then the next step is a secondary app for what you would usually use for the phone system, which then would be another QR code or another attachment. But again, this information is coming from multiple directions, so that's not all in one place. And as a result, we're creating that secondary authentication mechanism.
Awesome. No, that sounds great. And I know VoIP security hasn't been a topic of conversation in the past, especially in the channel. It's more about, the ease of use for VoIP, the remote capabilities, the cost savings. A lot of times, I know we don't want to hit on price, but security has usually not been something that MSPs have been proactive discussing. And I think sometimes they're worried about, bringing up additional issues with customers that aren't aware of that. What's the best approach for MSPs to have these conversations with their clients?
I think that, Brian, security is a hot topic right now, not just for what we're talking about today, but just generally, right? Ransomware, crypto viruses, all this whatever, that's happening out there. At the end of the day, hiding from the conversation on all of that front, email security, encryption, all of the stuff that you have to start really, locking down and bunkering down on, you just have to have the conversation. I'm going to tell you right now, your customer would rather you be in that dialogue before an event happens rather than after. I mean, I know that MSPs are always worried about price, and they don't want to put themselves in a situation where the customer just doesn't want to pay and all of that conversation that follows that. But at the end of the day, everyone who's been through a ransomware attack where the network's been down for days or weeks and they had to rebuild everything and restore from backup and reinstall operating systems, I mean, your customer at the end of that process is salty, real salty, and they should be. Yeah. And it sucks. But at the end of the day, it's a completely different story when you've come in ahead of time, you've put the pieces in place, you've had that hard conversation with your customer, and now all of a sudden you're not the guy that's on the headline on the news, when XYZ hospital, school, government entity, whatever gets attacked, or Puerto Rico, I think yesterday got spoofed for got tricked into a $2.4 million payment through a junk email that they got. It's just happening all over the place because the weakest link is the person behind the keyboard. Brian, you just have to have the conversation. Have the conversation now. Have it up front. Be proactive. Because I'm going to tell you right now, you as a business owner running a technology firm will be a lot happier being in that seat than on the seat of, hey, well, you were responsible for a technology. Why didn't you protect us? Well, Mr. Customer, you needed to pay more. That's not the best time to have that conversation.
That's excellent advice. I think is with many of the security discussions is basically you might just need to rip the Band-Aid off and let's talk raw and about the issues and just address them all. It may be a long discussion, but yeah, it has to happen today, especially with the vulnerabilities, that MSPs face too, and the liabilities that come back on providers. That you need to make sure you're doing the right thing for your client, but also that puts protection in place for your own business too. So
yeah, I mean, and just a final thought. I mean, on that, right? Update your master services agreements, right?
Yep.
Make sure you're protecting yourself. There's this concept of, oh, well, my customer can sign a waiver and I'm not going to be held responsible. Guys, you can't look at this in silos. Step back, zoom out, look at it from a total business conversation, and have a very serious conversation internally, with your own team saying, do we want to continue supporting people that aren't going to put the pieces in place to protect themselves? Because here's what's going to happen. If you don't, everything we talked about just 2 minutes ago could happen to you, but also the vendors that you're using, right? You see Microsoft, for example, is now trying to enforce, basic MFA on everyone, and it's a pain in the behind. Why don't you just get ahead of that stuff and have a comprehensive solution rather than this vendor has this version, this vendor has that version. Then you have 30 apps on your phone just to be able to work every day. But that it's going to be forced on you, the MSP. You basically have a predefined conversation. Hey, Mr. Customer, Microsoft is now dictating this. There's nothing we can do, but let's maybe take a look at this strategically and implement single sign-on or a unified MFA solution or something like that. And then that bridges the larger security conversation. The doors are wide open to really have it. The only reason it's not happening is because you're not happening. That's it.
Yeah. So, George, I think it's fair to say you see a secure VoIP solution as being a differentiator for MSPs as well.
I think it should be a checkbox. I think it should be a differentiator. The last thing you want to do is either rack up a phone bill and have to have that conversation with your customer on who's paying it, or B, have information leak out of the phone system, which your customer's not going to appreciate, either losing client information or hearing their voice somewhere else and having to pay some hacker from wherever to try and not have that go somewhere. So yeah, I do believe it's important.
Great. So George, it's always a pleasure talking with you. Unfortunately, we're running low on time. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, Brian, I just appreciate the invite to chat today. I understand that security is a very wide topic. I know voice is not really thought about when you're thinking about security, but it's just good to know that there are solutions out there. If it's not our solution, there are solutions out there. But not generally speaking, these are the questions that you may not be asking your vendors when it comes to your voice, your unified communication. So you should start asking those questions to make sure that the answers are correct, rather than finding out after the fact that you're in a bad place.
Makes perfect sense. So on behalf of IOTA, I'd like to thank today's guest, George Bardissi from bvoip, for joining us. Be sure to stop back every Wednesday for the latest episode of the Secure Connections podcast. And be sure to also to check out the latest cybersecurity solutions on our vendor page at iotsa.com. Have a safe and profitable week. Thank you.